black scholar.
I really try to take seriously the challenge of what progressive politics is, which is winning a majority of American people to a reorganization of the state and the economy and creating a society that is fundamentally more humane, a society that eradicates unemployment, that eradicates war, that eradicates patriarchy, and that eradicates racism. The only way we can do that is to have an ongoing discourse with the majority of American people, because socialism is, as we used to say, not going to fall out of the sky. It's going to be built right here with the human building blocks, which are working and poor people. And they live in neighborhoods. We got to reach them.
You are active, are you not, in the Democratic Socialist Alliance movement? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, let me make one minor correction.
Okay.
DSA is the Democratic Socialist of America. It is a political organization of people on the Democratic left who are committed to a progressive transformation of the political economy in this country in order to guarantee certain basic rights for working and poor people. We believe very strongly that no one should go hungry in this country, that no one should live in dilapidated housing, that no one should be deprived the right to a decent job, that American capitalism, the way it's structured, places the interests of the wealthy ahead of the interests of poor and working people. We argue that corporate capitalism in this country is designed to maximize profits, and it places profits ahead of people. We argue that the democratic reorganization of the economy is imperative so that people can be before profits. The members of the Democratic Socialists of America came together in March of 1982 from two different organizations. One was the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, DSOC, which was founded in 1972 by Michael Harrington, who is probably best known for his book, The Other America, which was responsible for, in large measure, for establishing the war on poverty 20 years ago. DSOC came out of the fractures in what once constituted the old Socialist Party. Many of the people in DSOC are active within the Democratic Party. A number of members of DSOC are, or were at that time, Ron Dellums, the congressperson from California, Julian Bond of Atlanta, a number of trade unionists, Bill Lucy, William Wimpesinger of the Machinist Union, a number of feminist leaders, Barbara Ehrenreich, a variety of people, primarily from the trade unions in the Democratic Party, electoral politics. NAM merged with DSOC. The New American Movement was a political organization that emerged out of what was once called the New Left of the 1960s. NAM's character was very different from DSOC's in the sense that most of the people tended to be younger. They came off of colleges in the 1960s. They were involved in civil rights work, feminist organizations, gay rights work, activism within the communities, grassroots mobilization. This was the first time in recent memory that two major left organizations merged in this country. The history of the left is really a history of splits. And by coming together, as of today, DSOC and NAM merging into DSA is now the largest democratic left organization in the country. We have in excess of 7,500 members. Mike Harrington is the chair. I am one of several vice chairs. And our task, as we see it, is at some point in the near future to place socialism on the American agenda.
Isn't there a real problem of bringing those two groups together, and even now, the fact that DSOC was working within the Democratic Party? They considered them at the left part of the spectrum of the Democratic Party, whereas the NAM people were working outside the party. And now they still, when they came together in this one organization, they still consider themselves within the Democratic Party. Isn't that terribly limiting? Because they never get anything, not even crumbs from the Democrats.
Well, I think that that's a trifle sectarian. And I say that as a representative of the left wing of this organization. Let's be realistic. One of the problems we have in America's political apparatus is that unlike other so-called democracies, there are a number of structural factors that limit the ability for progressives to develop independent political organizations. Bill Dimhoff, the political scientist, a number of other people have talked about this. First off, America's electoral system is executive-oriented rather than legislative-oriented. In other words, decisions tend to be made from the top down and not with adequate input from the legislative branches of government. A critical problem, too, is that the executives are elected separately from the representatives. In the UK, Peggy Thatcher is not elected by all of the British people. She's elected by the Parliament, and she is the representative of the majority party in Parliament. In the Knesset in Israel, when people run for office, slates are run so that if you receive 1% of the vote in this country, inside of Israel, for example, you receive one or that proportion of seats in the legislature. In this country, if you run for Congress in a district, you get 49% of the votes in a two-way race. The number of seats you get is 0. So you've got a built-in factor in America's electoral system that eliminates, or at least makes it extraordinarily difficult for third parties to operate effectively in gaining some kind of legitimacy at even a grassroots level.
Yet, man, you've argued recently in an article in these Times that perhaps some of the left in America should start thinking seriously about third-party building.
Exactly. In saying all of these things, by no means am I saying that independent politics cannot work. I'm simply pointing out the structural limitations inside of this system. Now, recognizing the limitations, I think that progressives need to put forward what I would term an inside-outside strategy. On the inside of the Democratic Party, there are a number of progressives who are nominally Democrats, but for all practical purposes, I think it would be deleterious to the left to run candidates against Ron Dellums, Julian Bond, Harold Washington of Chicago, and a number of other progressives who have been elected across the country. Simply to say that they are Democrats doesn't mean that they don't have the legitimate interests of the progressives within that community. But even in saying that, I would also insist that wherever the logistical possibility exists to run independent candidates, we on the left need to take advantage of that. There are ways to place it within some kind of historical context. Now, in this country, the biggest problem I think you have is not that we don't have a material base for socialism. If we had socialism in this country, the democracy, and by my definition of socialism, I don't mean anything like what I see over in the Soviet Union. What I think about as socialism is fundamentally public ownership of the central mode of production, the democratization of the workplace. In other words, people who produce the wealth ought to have the direct and final say on how things are produced and distributed, and they ought to own the basic things that come out of this society. I also think it means a principled ongoing struggle against the systems, the structures of oppression, such as patriarchy, racism, and I think you have to tackle these kinds of structures that are a separate struggle, although at times symbiotic, but a separate struggle from simply a class struggle in a very narrow sense. And I would also argue that as we develop a socialist society in this country, we have the material basis for it today. The biggest hassle I've run into as a political organizer is ideology. People basically live in a society that is so culturally dominated by individuality and by materialism, and people think of individual success. In fact, let me very briefly tell you a story. When I went to grad school, I went to the University of Maryland at College Park, and it was a big deal. I was the first person in my family to get a doctorate, right? And my mom, I love my mom, but my mom and I had political struggles. Mom flew out like from our home to College Park and stood outside the door waiting for me so she could be the first person to see Dr. Marable walk out, right? So I came out of the door after defending my dissertation, and she said, "Son, did you cross the River Jordan?" You know, biblical, right? So it was understandable. And I said, "Yeah, Mom, I made it to the other side." Tears came in her eyes. She said, "Son, I'm so proud of you." She thought a minute. She began to conjure up a vision of success for Manning, right? She said, "Just think, 10 years from today, you can become a black Henry Kissinger." So what could I say? I said, "Mom, that is exactly what I do not intend to become." Right? But that's what I mean by capitalist ideology. And that's what infiltrates in people's consciousness. And you have to fight against that. That's what Amilcar Cabral, the African revolutionist, used to say. The biggest struggle is not against our oppressors. The biggest struggle is against our own weaknesses, our own contradictions. That's what we have to overcome. There was a struggle around the race question, but what we didn't understand, well, what some social sciences have been putting forward recently, is that it's not a race question, that it's a class question, that it's really an economic thing, and that racism, that race as a category is insignificant. There is the declining significance of race. That's what some social scientists argue. My argument is that this is not a real argument. That the real question is, how do racism as systems and we could say classism, but I would prefer to call it by its real name, monopoly capitalism. How do capitalist structures and racist structures impact upon the majority of black people? And what we discover is not race or class, it's both. It's both. And there is no contradiction between that. There's no contradiction between saying patriarchy is a system that is interdependent with structures of capitalism. We can see this quite clearly in American society. Same thing is true for racism. That racism as a system is not racial prejudice or bad vibes. You just don't like black people because they're black for some metaphysical reason. Racism is a system that is rooted in the historic exploitation of black labor power and black political, cultural, and social life. And that in many ways it infuses with capitalism as a structure, but in other ways it is rather independent, okay, with it. So that when we say we oppose capitalism and we have to have a class struggle, that is not to say that we also are oblivious to race, because racism as a structure is as real as this wall back here, right?
Have we made real progress?
In relative terms, yes. In absolute terms, no. We won't have fundamental progress until everybody in this country goes to bed with a full stomach every night. And we won't have full progress until everybody who wants to work has a guaranteed income or a job. And we won't have fundamental progress until the great majority of our people control the mode of production, and that there is no racism in this country, that it becomes outlawed, and there is no institutionalized sexism in this country. Until we defeat those institutions, and until we have a true democracy in this country, a biracial and a non-sexist democracy, then fundamentally we will still not have progress. In relative terms, yes, but in fundamental terms, no.
Thank you.
So what I'm suggesting here is that we need to develop a very concrete notion of what history means. We've got a whole bunch of people who have never experienced, who are under the age of 20, who personally never experienced Jim Crow. Do you ever remember seeing the signs, black and white? Can you, at a personal level?
No.
No, okay. I remember as a kid going into clothing stores. If I tried on a pair of white pants, pants in a white store, I would be killed. Or you use a bathroom that said whites only, you would be shot. And I think that that has a real impact on your personal development and on your politics. So that in a kind of perverse way, the absence of those kinds of legal structures or strictures against your humanity, in a real sense, desensitizes you to what the character of the struggle is. Because the system out here is every bit as racist as it was when they put up the sign. But with the sign down, people's guards drop. And they're not quite as aware of the need to understand their own history and the need to struggle. So I would argue that first, people need to really understand their history. Secondly, they need to be involved in a political organization at a grassroots level. I'm not here to tell people which one they ought to get involved in. Anything, as Malcolm used to say, that fights for black people's interests, that you can participate in, whatever it is, take part in it. And if it's not fighting for black liberation or black people's interests, then don't take part in it. So I would think that through the theory of study, and reflecting on our history and our past struggles, and the practice of being involved in a concrete program, whether it's voter education, whether it's voter registration, whether it's working with a community grassroots group, whether it's saving a black high school, whether it's holding a Black History Month celebration with black community kids, these kinds of political educational events help provide the practice for you that unites the theory. The theory and practice is what makes any kind of social change take place. I think we need to go beyond the notion of coalitions, because all too often a coalition has been a very temporal thing based on immediate political expediency. I would like to see a common program which is comprised of what one political theorist, Andre Gores, calls non-reform reforms. A non-reform reform is a political reform that cannot be fully resolved within the framework of the existing political and economic system. It's those kinds of strategies, for example, strategies that constrict the right of capital to move from one state to the other. A strategy that says any plant that wants to close has to give workers a 2-year advance notice before it moves. And that if it does move, it has to pay taxes to the state and local government for a period of 5 years, same level of taxes, after it moves. Now all of these kinds of reforms are not revolutionary, but they are reforms that can be won and are being won in some local areas that will restrict the prerogative of capital. And what we want to do is have capital have a hardening of the arteries. And in doing these kinds of strategies, we can, as black people, as women, as oppressed gays, as national minorities, as working people, trade unionists, as Native Americans, as Puerto Ricans and Chicanos, we can build an independent movement that is interdependent, that is a variety of social formations that agree to a common program which articulates a vision of society that can be fought for and won in the future. And by dialectically struggling in principal unity with each other, we can achieve that society.
That's Alternative Views for this evening. Alternative Views is a production of the Alternative Information Network. Good night.